When Belfast detectives began to examine the scene of a savage murder more than 40 years ago, they could not have realized how critical it was that they find some clue as to the assailant. Their failure to discover anything of value beyond the victim's personal effects would leave a shadow over the case to this very day. Throughout November and December 1952, the Royal Ulster Constabulary were under considerable pressure. They were investigating the murder here in White Abbey of Patricia Curran. She came from an important family. Her father had been a Unionist MP, Attorney General in the Northern Ireland government, and was now a High Court judge. But no amount of effort could establish a motive or produce any useful forensic evidence about the murder. It was 2 months before police began to feel they were on the right track. An RAF serviceman from a nearby base was responding unsatisfactorily to routine questioning. Iain Gordon knew the Currans and had been alone on the evening the murder was committed. After being interrogated for 3 days, he was charged with the crime. In March 1953, he was tried and convicted at Belfast Crown Court, a verdict that initially was supported by public opinion. But what really happened on the 12th of November 1952, when Patricia Curran was stabbed to death, was to become a subject of growing fascination, speculation, and anxiety. Many people believed Patricia's brother Desmond could help explain the mystery. He had befriended Gordon some months before the murder and introduced the serviceman to his family. He had found Patricia's body and was himself questioned at length by police. Later, he supplied them with information about Gordon. Several years after the murder, Desmond, a Presbyterian and a barrister, became a Roman Catholic and entered the priesthood. In Northern Ireland, this was a highly irregular conversion of faith. It also led him away from his home country for good. In the succeeding decades, the province has been ravaged by terrorist violence, but the murder in the Glen has not been forgotten. The suspicion lingers that this was Northern Ireland's greatest unsolved crime, and that the man who paid the penalty was not Patricia Curran's killer.
I would say I'm a missionary parish priest. Of course, to work for social justice is an essential part of the Christian faith, so I would like to be remembered as someone who worked for social justice. Many years ago, a young man killed my sister. I think perhaps he was possessed by a demon when he did this thing. He is still alive. I must be ready to forgive him. I must be ready to accept him as a brother, a human being, and to go forward with him. If we cannot do this, if we cannot forgive our enemies and go forward, even those who have killed our people, we cannot have a new country with justice and peace.
I feel my body's been destroyed just as Patricia Curran, but in a different way. I mean, if you toss a £10 note down the drain, for instance, you can scrape and save and you can get it back if you want. But if you lose a year out of your life, or 8 years, whatever, for no fault of your own, there's no way you're ever going to get that back. Because you only pass this way once. I believe that Desmond Curran could tell us a great deal more about what happened that night. He is the only surviving direct member of the family. He owes it to himself, he owes it to others, and he certainly owes it to me because I was locked up for 8 years for murder I didn't commit.
Desmond Curran came from a very staunch Presbyterian family.
His father was a unionist politician and would have been a member of the Orange Order.
Lance Curran, as we knew him, was our MP and later became Attorney General.
Desmond was the eldest of Lance and Doris Curran's 3 children. Michael was 2 years younger, and Patricia 4 years younger again.
We got on well. I got on very well with my brother, always did. And I got on well with my parents, particularly with my father.
I knew Desmond as being a very tense, in many ways awkward young man, tall, somewhat imposing and not intimidating, because he was a very kind, gentle soul, but somebody who was looking for something, for some point of reference.
I think I was a fairly quiet and reserved individual. I wasn't a mixer, my brother was, but I had a few friends. I had a number of good friends, but not many.
Iain Gordon, when he came here first, he was a strange boy. But I don't think he made many friends. Being so nervous, being so shy, it put other boys off rather than encouraged other boys to play with him. His family all came from a whole range of school teachers. His grandfather was the headmaster of the school along here, and his mother was determined that nothing less would do for her Iain.
Gordon's early life had been somewhat out of the ordinary. He grew up in Burma, where his father was an oil engineer. At the age of 6, his mother sent him home to Scotland to begin his education as a boarder at Dollar Academy, not far from Stirling. But at the height of the German bombardment of Britain in 1940, he was returned to his parents' care.
I was 8 years old. I was in a convoy going out to Burma. It started off with 37 boats and ended up with 8 when we got into Cape Town. We had boat drill 3 times a night. I was in a cabin with 2 other men, and the alarm bell was right outside my bunk, and every time it went off, I literally jumped out of my skin. And eventually, I was frightened to go to sleep. Once in Burma, after a comparatively short period, we had to flee because the Japanese invaded and conquered Burma. We ended up in India, where I contracted malaria quite badly with my mother. So about 1943, I found myself in another convoy coming back home again.
He came home without a toy, whereas Mum and Dad had given me plenty over the days. Train sets, fort, everything. My favourite game was war games. We'd murder airplanes. We used to use dominoes as bombs and drop the bombs on the toy soldiers, bomb the toy fort. But Iain was never really happy with that either. And in hindsight now, when you look back on it, he had come through the real thing, the real war. Did you ever polish any of them? He would sit and talk, for football especially, for ages and ages. But it was hard to put up with him when he was doing that. Because of his nervousness, as I say, his insistent way of talking, going right up to your face to make his point, and his hand for all the time, playing with his hair, pulling his hair down, pulling at it, while he's talking to you. You see, is it all right? Is it all right? You sure it's all right? And that sort of attitude altogether, well, the other boys just laughed at it. put them all off altogether.
When they reached 18, Ian Clark remembers his friend being kept on at school while he was called up for his national service.
For his age, he was further behind than any of the other boys in this country. And he was pushed and pushed and pushed to try and get on. His national service was deferred because his mother was determined he was going to his college.
I commenced my national service in 1951. Coming near the end of our training, we were being called out. And when it came to my name, I was called out, you march to the front, etc. And the sergeant says, Gordon, we don't like your marching, so we're sending you to Northern Ireland. So I've often thought afterwards, this must have been one of the most fateful decisions that the sergeant ever made in his entire life.
The war had just ended, and I got an exhibition to Trinity Hall, Cambridge, in classics. So I took it up. My parents obviously wanted me to study law, although they didn't push me in any way to do so. So I just fell in with that.
After winning a first in classics, Desmond returned to Belfast to complete his bar final at Queen's and was called to the bar in the middle of 1952.
He did practice at the bar for a while, but it was perfectly clear that he was never going to be comfortable in that really dreadful profession of rough and tumble.
I did only one criminal case that I can remember of people accused of stealing Guinness off the back of a lorry, and they, rightly or wrongly, they were acquitted. I enjoyed it all right, but there was something missing when I didn't feel that this was my life's work.
By this stage, Desmond's interest in religion had begun to flourish. Influenced by a cousin, he'd become active in the student Christian movement at Queen's and served a term as Irish chairman. He also came in contact with beliefs beyond the mainstream churches.
I became interested in moral rearmament. It's a movement which was started by an American Lutheran clergyman called Frank Bookman, and their message is live by absolute moral standards, absolute honesty, absolute purity, absolute unselfishness, and absolute love, and by the guidance of God. They encourage people to have what they call a quiet time every morning, time when they will read something from a spiritual book and talk to God about what they read and ask for God's guidance for the day. And those who are taking it seriously work together in groups.
They were men and women standing up and proclaiming their sins, their testimonies of Christian faith and so on, almost a confessional, if you like, rather like that, a confessional. And I found it extremely boring.
But it was at these meetings that Desmond first had any meaningful contact with Catholics.
I had never really got to know a Catholic to talk to on even terms. Most of the Catholics I knew had been servants, and it's helped to get rid of any prejudice I might have had against Catholics or Catholicism.
I have to say that Michael, the younger brother, was not very sympathetic with Desmond or his moral problems. And I often used to hear him chiding Desmond in company. I know Michael didn't take kindly to Desmond's difficulties, which he wouldn't have understood.
On Sundays, Desmond continued to join his family for morning service in the Presbyterian church near their home in White Abbey, just north of Belfast. Another member of the congregation, stationed at a small Royal Air Force camp in the village, was a young Scotsman.
After one of the services, it wasn't the first one or the second one, after some time, this person came down I had no idea who it was. Shook hands with me. Shook hands with me by the left hand, which I found rather odd, and explained that he was Desmond Curran. Father was a judge with the right to come home from dinner.
I remember him as he was smaller. I was going to say small, but he's certainly smaller than I am. I remember him as wearing an RAF uniform, seeing him sitting there in church, and he was clearly very unhappy.
It was the first time I'd really been away from home. I wasn't very streetwise clever, but I didn't know an awful lot of people, apart from my colleagues in the Air Force and going into Belfast and meeting girls at dances, etc. So I went along with him.
It was not uncommon then for the notable families to invite these airmen who were a long way from home and couldn't get home for weekends and so on, to invite them to their own homes and show them hospitality. They considered it as one of the duties that they fulfilled in the community, if you like.
As I got to know him, I found there was something very peculiar about him. It was almost as if there was something bottled up inside him and that this was trying to get out.
I was introduced to the judge, and Desmond says, "Father, this is one of the lads at Edenmore," and the judge was reading one of the Sunday heavies, and he hardly took any notice of me. When we went into dinner, his whole presence seemed to dominate the table. Everyone seemed was looked towards him before opening their mouth. It was a rather unnerving experience. I felt out of place, that I felt, you know, that they looked upon as if I shouldn't be there. I felt Patricia Curran was seemed to me to be the only normal person in that family, in a sense. That from a, yeah, I think she went out of her way to make me feel at home.
The only thing I can remember about Iain Hay Gordon being in the Glen House was this occasion when my mother and sister complained about my bringing him, saying that there was something wrong with him and asking me not to bring him anymore. My sister, I remember, said, "You know, you've got to think of us too." But I said, "Oh no, that wouldn't be Christian. He needs help," so I continued to bring him home.
Next time, he said they wanted to talk about moral rearmament. He said 2 members would get together and they would write down their innermost thoughts, and they would try and help each other. And then they would pass the piece of paper over and they would peruse each other's paper and see how they could help the new recruit or the new member.
He said he was being persecuted by the other airmen because he was a Scot. And he also told me that he carried a knife for self-defense.
He wrote furiously. You know, I couldn't get over it. He wrote the reams. I had great difficulty writing anything down. I wrote things like, you know, I want to be a credit to God, my country, my king, kind of. You know, I couldn't even think what to write. I felt I better put something down, that I wanted to be a success in life, wanted to leave the Air Force, do my job well, married, have children, something along those lines. But I had great difficulty in writing something. I doubt if I wrote more than 15 or 20 lines. But when he showed me his, you know, it was an island, I have a plan for Iain, God has a plan for Iain. If Iain puts me in his hands, I will help him to lead a much more richer, fuller life. I will help Iain. I will be his friend. I will help him with his problems. I think it was, I can only remember being, you know, completely taken aback at this.
I'm sure that my motive was to get him to be a better Christian, I suppose. But I think it's highly probable that I did have the intention of inviting him to moral rearmament meetings, but I don't think I ever did.
I said I was studying for a trade examination in the RAF, and I felt I had enough on my plate without having to do this. and he seemed to be a bit annoyed. I thought his attitude was a bit childish. Patricia is someone that was there when I was having a dinner with the family or seeing Desmond. I got the impression that she was a very sensible, level-headed girl that had her feet firmly on the ground. I did see her on a couple of occasions in church, but I just never entertained a thought that I ever wanted to see Patricia socially. When we did talk, it was just purely an everyday subject that I can't possibly remember now.
Patricia Curran was a very quiet girl, very reserved, nice manners. The first time I met her was at the house on one occasion where we were having a divisional committee meeting, and she came in to serve refreshments, and I was the only young person in the house who was more or less of her age, and we had quite a long conversation that evening.
She had just started at the university. She had been there for about 3 weeks, I think, when she was murdered.
That night, I got on the bus, the Carrickfergus bus, at the bus station in Wine Tavern Street, Smithfield Station. I'd been sitting about maybe 5 minutes when Patricia came in, and in a way past, she spoke to me and up took a seat at the front of the bus. I sat on, and then when we got to White Abbey, she came down and she was waiting to, there were 3 or 4 people in front of her getting off the bus, and she passed a few words with me, and I sort of asked them how the family were keeping, and she said, well, and she got off the bus. And that was the last I saw her.
I have a memory about walking to the bus station through the centre of Belfast fairly late on, and the next thing I can remember is my mother coming in and saying that your sister hasn't come home, we're worried. We were worried all the time about Patricia coming through the glen in the dark, because it was a dangerous place. I do remember finding Patricia's body. I do remember that this gave me a great shock. I can remember bending down and raising the body and hearing what sounded to me like breathing. I realize now it must have simply been air being expelled from the lungs.
Desmond Curran began to search the grounds of Glen House shortly after 1:30 in the morning. Within a short time, he found the body of his sister lying face up among the trees. He called out to his father, who'd been to fetch the village constable. Together, they lifted the body over to the lane where the family solicitor and close friend, Malcolm Davison, had drawn up his car. The legs were stiff. They had difficulty getting the body into the back seat.
I don't remember any policeman being there, but I picked up the body, and as I say, I believed she was still alive, or at least there was a chance that she was still alive. And I think that the others went along with that they didn't want to upset me, but I think it must have been fairly obvious to them that she was in fact dead. because rigor mortis had begun to set in.
Why would they not have wanted to upset you in particular? Presumably they were quite upset themselves.
Well, I just don't know. I mean, this is all pure conjecture, but I think they may have thought that I would have been even more upset if I had realized that she was dead.
There obviously came a point very shortly after that when you did realize that she was dead.
Yes, I can remember the doctor, Dr. Wilson, saying, "Oh, she's dead. She's dead."
Can you remember how you responded to that?
No, I can't remember any particular reaction.
Do you remember the reaction of your father or your mother, or the atmosphere in your home that night?
I can't remember anything more about that night. I can remember that in the car on the way to the doctor's that I prayed very hard all the time, asking God to keep her alive. I thought that there was a chance that she was alive.
I was early morning duty reporter in the Telegraph. Arrived in, and my first duty was to ring the police and the Harvard Police and the fire brigades to find out what had happened overnight. And my call to the police revealed to me that a judge's daughter had been killed, had been murdered during the night. Her body had been found, and then I asked which judge, and they said Judge Curran. And I was absolutely astonished.
It was a dark November morning, and this made the tragedy even that more horrific and grim.
We had civilian workers that worked at Edenmore, and one was a gentleman called Frank Swain, and he cycled to and from, and he came up and he said, there's been a girl murdered or shot in White Abbey, but he didn't mention any name.
We were one of the first places that the RUC came to. There was, I suppose, inevitably, it always happens, there's a feeling, oh, well, this wouldn't be one of the local people, it's probably one of these outsiders that we have got in our district. And so quite quickly they came along and wanted to know what everybody had been doing that night.
There was a big dance at the Women's Royal Air Force camp in Dundonald, and literally everyone at Edenmore was there. I was literally on my own that night. I was typing in the central registry. I had failed an RAF trade exam, and I've never liked being beaten or failing at anything, so I wanted to get it a second time round. It was just practice typing. Typed from AP 3184, Manual of Office Writing and Service Management. I never kept the sheets.
He wasn't one of the crowd, and I think that he was really quite diffident about meeting girls of his own age, and so it would have been quite like him.
But his evening alone at the typewriter was not to become the primary concern detectives had about leading aircraftsman Gordon. Their attention began to focus on an earlier period, around tea time. They believed Patricia Curran had been murdered shortly after getting off the bus from Belfast. Gordon had been alone at this time too, but that's not what he told the police.
Flight Sergeant Maxey said, I don't know if he meant this to sound exactly as it did sound. Arrange amongst yourselves who you were with and go up to the top table where I think it was Sergeant Reetham of the RAF Police was there. Now I was sitting at, each table maybe you got about 6 people on either side. Corporal Connor was sitting opposite me, and unknown to me, he obviously didn't have an alibi. And someone said to read over and said to me, "You say you were Corporal Curran." I said, "I can't very well say that because I wasn't with him, I was on my own," and someone else said, "It won't matter." So I very foolishly allowed myself to be pressurised to going up the Corporal corner and making up an alibi that we'd been together that night.
Just by the luck of the draw, I come up with Gordon. So just went up and asked us questions, and as we were walking up, Gordon just said to me, "If they asked us any questions, will you say me and you were together on the night of a question?"
And what did you say?
I said, yes. And at the time, they didn't know really. I think. So I did. I said, aye, yes.
Why did you agree to tell a lie?
Well, I didn't know, think. Tell you the truth, I wasn't thinking at the time. And the reason why I said it, Gordon was a kind of a person. He was kind of, says, he was a kind of a person to me. He was just a kind of wee bit, stupid.
Obviously, with the benefit of hindsight, it was an extremely foolish and stupid thing to do in the height of a murder inquiry. And possibly the only reason I went with it was that I knew I was innocent. I hadn't killed Patricia Curran, so I didn't see any harm with it.
After several days, the Royal Ulster Constabulary were making little apparent progress. They now knew the victim had suffered 37 stab wounds, but they could find no weapon or anything that could be linked forensically to Patricia Curran's killer in or near the glen. Nor could they verify other key pieces to the puzzle, like the precise time of death or the place where she had been first attacked. Through the newspapers, there were appeals for a strange assortment of suspects to come forward. A man seen speeding by the glen in an Austin 10, a scar-faced man, another man with hay seeds in his hair spotted in a local cafe. There was no focused line of inquiry. An increasingly desperate situation called for an urgent measure.
Scotland Yard were called in, and Detective Superintendent John Capstick, who was supposed to be one of the leading police officers in Britain at the time, arrived with Detective Sergeant Dennis Hawkins. From the moment he arrived, Capstick was going to solve this case in the shortest possible time, and it would be no time until he had an arrest. I met him in the evenings. He held court at the Royal Avenue Hotel. We all went in the pressmen to have a drink and to hear the latest from Capstick at night. He was very full of confidence.
I can remember being questioned by Sergeant Devaney. I can remember being with him for quite a while, and that he asked me a lot of questions.
Did you ever feel that any finger of suspicion was pointing directly at you?
I got the feeling during that interview with Sergeant Devaney that perhaps they were investigating this possibility, that perhaps he did have in the back of his mind the idea, did he do it, did he do it?
Desmond Curran was not the only one to come under close scrutiny from detectives. By the time they'd finished their inquiries, they had conducted 40,000 interviews and taken down 9,000 statements. But eventually, their suspicions narrowed. Desmond was eliminated from inquiries after a number of solicitors and court officials verified his presence at the Belfast Law Courts until 8 o'clock on the evening in question.
Although Iain Gordon was questioned on a number of occasions between the time of the murder and Christmas 1952, this wasn't particularly a matter that we paid attention to because a number of other people were questioned at the same time.
Perhaps from anything from 2 to 4 occasions, IOC officers came up to me in uniform and they were almost pleading or begging me, I got the impression, to try and find someone who could vouch for me. One of them said, can you not even find one person can say they saw you? And that will take the heat off you.
In fact, he'd been trying to do so since news of the murder had first reached the camp.
I said, if any of you did see me, I would expect you to come forward and say so. But I wasn't saying whether you saw me or not, I would expect you would come forward and say so.
I didn't have any automatic reaction that Iain did it, but gradually I began to remember things. The fact that he had told me he carried a knife for self-defense, that he had felt he was being persecuted, the fact that my mother and sister had asked me not to bring him because they felt there was something wrong with him. And I met Iain a couple of times, and I gradually became convinced that he had done it. And this was before he made any confession.
Did you tell the police that you were convinced that Iain had done it?
I don't know. I do not know.
But surely if you knew in your own mind who had murdered your sister, you were bound to tell the police?
I would suspect that I passed on my suspicions to Sergeant Devaney, was the person to whom I was closest among the police.
Did you tell your father? Because presumably he was very close to the Inspector General.
I don't know. I do not know.
I went and reeved the Christmas reeve to Glasgow and was there 2 or 3 weeks. And I had, I don't know whether I'm slightly psychic or not, but I had the impression in Dora when I was there, I was desperately worried. All I did was read books to occupy my mind. If I'd had an ounce of sense, I would have told my mother.
Instead, Gordon confided in Desmond Curran. They had met since the murder and had discussed it at some length. Now Gordon continued the contact by letter. This is a typewritten copy verified by the police. Gordon promised to spare no effort to help, but added, "Once again, Desmond, I must stress that I know nothing that can be of any real importance." He recounted a dream in which he and another person had found a young woman strangled in her bedroom, and he asked Desmond to destroy the letter. Desmond replied. He said he had broken Iain's confidence and told a policeman some of the things we had spoken of, including information about someone identified only as WC. Curiously, Desmond added advice about accomplice evidence in law. He explained that the evidence of a witness to a house break-in, for example, could not on its own be used to convict a suspect if the suspect told police that the witness was helping him to break in. No one can be convicted on the evidence of an accomplice alone, he wrote, adding, "This means that if anyone gives information about the murderer, he cannot do them any harm, even if he tries to implicate them in the crime."
You have shown me a letter which I wrote to him. If you had asked me, I would not have been able to tell you that I wrote letters to him. But I see that I did write at least one letter to him.
Desmond was shown copies of the letters he received from his friend. He suggested that, taken together, the correspondence indicated he was stringing Gordon along to help the police gather information about his sex life. The references to accomplice evidence were to allay Gordon's fears about sexual encounters he told Desmond he'd had with another man. That man was W.C., Wesley Courtney, a homosexual living in White Abbey who gave an interview to police claiming a relationship with Iain Gordon, an offence that could have landed them both in prison, but as Desmond had advised, not on the evidence of an accomplice alone. Iain Gordon has never denied going out with Courtney, but has always insisted their meetings were nothing more than naive experimentations on his part. Courtney's version of these events will never be known. He died in 1964 and is buried in this unmarked grave in West Belfast.
Wesley Courtney was actually a very sociable person. When I met him in White Abbey, he asked me to go out with him. I'd heard about these people and I didn't know anything about it, and I was just interested to see what made them tick, etc. So we were round the back of Gren House, between Gren House And the RAF camp at Edenmore, it was quite dense, quite overgrown. So he wanted to touch me, or me to touch him, and then he wanted to go further, and I said I didn't want to go any further.
On how many occasions did Wesley suggest homosexual activity with you?
Perhaps 2 or 3 at the most. I didn't see him all that many occasions, maybe 4 times at the most.
And you consented to some sort of activity with him each time?
I remember the first time, I just haven't got a clear memory of the other time, perhaps, but it never went any further than that.
Even today, there is a rumour, firmly believed by many who took an interest in the case, that Gordon's friendship with Desmond Curran was of a similar nature.
There was never any kind of homosexual dealings between myself and Desmond Curran. When I saw him on the night of the murder, when I never left the camp, at any time. Now, whether there was some kind of homosexual ring in White Abbey, I have no idea. I just don't know.
I never heard that rumour, and there's no foundation for it.
Let me put it to you now that there were people who said at the time that Iain Hay Gordon and yourself were involved in a homosexual relationship.
No, well, it is not true. I've never been involved in a homosexual relationship.
And they actually went beyond that and said that you may have been in some way involved with Patricia's death.
Well, this is also not true.
Me, I come from Wesley Courtenay. He was a very sociable person, very. I got the impression, hearing him talking in the bus, etc., he was quite free with his tongue. He may have mentioned he'd been with me to some people. And if indeed there was a ring, this would be one way the information would be passed around. But I can't really give you any other answer because I don't know.
One can only speculate on whether rumours of a relationship between Iain Gordon and Desmond Curran were inspired by Courtenay. But what is certain is that Courtenay's statement about his relationship with Gordon had pointed the murder inquiry very firmly in the serviceman's direction.
I travelled back on the RAF steamer. I got a message that I was to go down to White Abbey Police Barracks, and Flight Sergeant Maxey had been at me to get my hair cut. So I told him I had to go down to the White Abbey Barracks. So he said, "We'll get your hair cut when they're finished with you." He didn't seem to attach much importance at the time. He never seemed to attach much importance to the fact the interrogation that I was going through.
I think he was County Inspector Kennedy at the time, but certainly somebody on his behalf came along and asked if they could interview Iain Gordon. And my reply to that, of course, was yes, they could. I mean, in the event, we couldn't have said no, but we also said at the time that we would very much prefer it if an RAF officer could be present during the interview, and that this was normal procedure as far as we were concerned when somebody was the subject of an investigation. And so whoever it was said, well, we'll go and ask Iain Gordon if he wants an officer there with him. And the answer came back and said, no, we didn't. So we didn't think anything more of it for that particular day.
Gordon was questioned by Head Constable Sam Russell of the RUC and John Capstick's deputy from Scotland Yard, Detective Sergeant Dennis Hawkins. For 6 hours, he was taken over the statements he'd made during previous interviews.
They let me go away for my dinner at 12 o'clock. That was 3 hours I was there answering questions. So I went back from 2 to 5, and again I was questioned about my life in Burma, about sex life, if I masturbated, etc., etc. But there was no really undue pressure that particular time.
The day after that, then they asked if they could see him again, and we repeated the same request, that he should certainly be given the opportunity of having an officer with him. And the message came back again that no, he'd said he didn't. And at that stage, I thought this was a matter of sufficient concern to go and talk to my superior officer, who was Wing Commander Jackson.
When I went down the second day, the police won't admit this, but I was down there from about 9 o'clock. I got back to camp, I think, about 7:45 at night, non-stop. I was never out of their sight for a minute. And even if I went to the toilet, one of them came with me. Now, in evidence, County Inspector Kennedy said I was free to leave at any time. That certainly wasn't my impression. I felt very much I was under suspicion. I never had any opportunity to see an RAF officer or family or a friend. Although the police said that offer was made to me, it was never made. It was never once suggested that I should have anybody with me.
There wasn't actually anything we could do about it, since the civil authority were conducting this case under their own rules.
Kept pressing me, and everything I said was a lie. We know more about you than you tell. We know all about you. And eventually I thought, well, if I tell them the truth about the Connor alibi, it might get them off my back. So I explained what happened from my point of view. So what actually happened then was I was left alone for a while, and Russell went out to see Connor at his home in Lisburn, I think.
I was up on Lisburn, and I was up on this 7 days leave. I was in the house getting shaved, and there's a knock at the door, and there's a couple of men from the Royal Ulster Constabulary. They said, you have to come with us back again down to a place. So I went down, and I was sat down the same place, capstick at the middle, a couple of gentlemen of the Royal Ulster Constabulary on my left, and the other side right. And capstick said to me, look, you better tell us the truth. Iain Hay Gordon has confessed. So all of a sudden he said, now, you tell us the truth. Was Iain Hay Gordon with you that night? I says, no.
When Russell came back, he came and strolled in like someone demented, shouting, lies, lies, all lies. Corporal Curran says it was you who suggested it.
Lies! Lies!
They put the pressure on more and more. Russell kept saying, you're a liar, you've been a sick boy for a while. If you don't confess, all your past sexual life will come out and it will kill your mother. And my mother had always meant a great deal for me, and they actually began to convince me of this. I think the last thing that I wanted my mother to find out was things like being with Courtney and being with prostitutes on a couple of occasions in Belfast. He walked up and down, stood above me with his fists clenched, banged the table, and said, when I think of that poor girl walking up the glen, my blood boils. It was all very intimidating and threatening. It was like being, interviewed by Hitler's Gestapo or Stalin's secret police without the physical beatings up. During the last 2 or 3 hours, I was in a very small room. I would reckon it would be about 12 feet by maybe 4. There was a table and there were chairs. And there was Capstick, Kennedy, Russell, and Hawkins, and they were all firing questions at me at once.
Tell us the truth.
Now, people have said to me, you just sit there and say nothing.
We know all about you.
I'm afraid it's just not that simple.
I'm getting fed up with you.
They were all firing questions. Whatever I said, you're a liar, you're telling lies, you'll go to hell for telling lies, you'll be hanged, you won't have a dog's chance, you'll go to hell. Now, this was repeated over and over and over again. I was really shattered. I was literally all in. I was mentally and physically exhausted. And it was 7:45. I was there literally almost something like 15 minutes short of 11 hours non-stop, being questioned non-stop. No access to anyone outside the police.
Still no arrest was made. Gordon was allowed to return to Edenmore camp overnight, but asked to report back to the police the next morning.
Why I never made a phone call home that night is always remain one of the biggest mysteries of my life. Because it was very obvious the way things was going, but it seemed so unreal. just seems as if it wasn't happening to me.
As time went on, we came firmly to the conclusion that probably the police had come upon something in his background, we didn't know what, that he certainly didn't want to disclose to us. And for that reason, he was making sure that there wasn't anybody there from the Royal Air Force who would become aware of what this was.
On the third morning, Gordon was left alone with Chief Superintendent Capstick. Later, Capstick would admit to the court that for the next 3 hours, he interviewed the suspect about what were called matters beyond the scope of the case. In plain language, his sex life.
Capstick started something like, Gordon boy, that was how he referred to me. You've been sick for a while, and we'll let you go home. He said this actually the night before as well. We'll let you go home as a free man. And he distinctly used the word as a free man. He said, if you were, he said, no one need know. We don't have to take you to the court. We don't have to tell your parents because you're not a juvenile. You're over 16. If you were under 16, we would have to notify your parents. But he said, we'll let you go home to consult a doctor. You've been a sick boy. We all have these feelings. We all have these temptations. We'll let you go home. But if you don't, there's nothing we can do for you. You'll be hanged and you'll go to hell. And I was really in quite a very agitated state just now. I really worried sick. He said, the shock of all this will kill your mother, your dear mother as he called her. And he really preyed on my fears of this to the extent. And he kept on and on. And I said, why don't you believe me? Why won't you leave me alone? I've told you I've nothing to do with it. And he kept saying, now I'm losing patience. When I talked with it, he would, without actually shouting the way Head Constable Russell did, he would change his tone of voice and say, now I'm getting fed up with you, Gordon boy, we're trying to help you. And you're not cooperating or helping us at all. And Vattery that afternoon, he said, suppose you had met Miss Curran, what would have happened? It was like a game of charade. He was saying, suppose you had met Miss Curran, what would you have said? Good evening, Pat, something like this. And I said, yes. So that went down as I met Miss Curran that night. Would you walk up, would you put your arms around her shoulder or on her breast, whatever? I would say, possibly, probably. Then that went down as a statement of fact. Now the whole confession from beginning to end was Capstick's wording. Not one of it was mine. It came out as if I had written it. But it was this kind of charade, this kind of game he was playing. And I didn't realise the trap I was falling myself into. And when it said all this, he said, well, we'll put that down. And then when I refused to sign it, he called County Inspector Kennedy and said, this man refuses to sign this confession. And Kennedy started shouting at me, he hadn't a very strong voice, but the best he could muster, that I could be charged with wasting police time and money, etc., etc. And left me alone. The two of them left me alone, and I was completely washed out. You know, I was actually like this, you know, completely sprayed out. I felt I had a body, and my mind wasn't controlling. I felt my whole body had been destroyed, and it didn't have a mind or any kind of feelings in it of its own accord. I felt completely devastated as a person. I couldn't stop myself falling asleep or getting drowsy. In fact, I actually thought my coffee had been drugged. I was so tired. And they walked out and left me to think of signing it, and I was walking up and down, wringing my hands, saying, oh, I sign it, or won't I sign it, oh, I sign it, or won't I sign it. I mean, I actually believed they were going to let me home. I mean, no sane person would really believe this in a gruesome murder inquiry like this, but I actually believed it. I was on the absolute edge.
So you signed?
I signed.
Then how did you feel?
I felt relieved. But when I started to ask Captain, going home, his manner changed. If he asked me something sensible, I'll answer it. He was totally unsympathetic.
The biggest manhunt in Northern Ireland's history was over. It had lasted 2 months. Countless hours of detective work had produced one piece of evidence on which the entire case would rest. A confession that Iain Gordon had met Patricia Curran after she'd got off the bus, and that she had asked him to escort her home. As they walked through the glen, she had agreed to a kiss, but resisted his more intimate advances. He attacked her with his service knife and dragged her body into the trees. As he returned to Edenmore camp, he had hurled the knife into Belfast Lough. The confession said that Gordon didn't remember the actual attack. It was solely due to a blackout.
When Iain was eventually charged with murder, what were your feelings then?
I don't know. I mean, I've been thinking a lot about these things over the past few days because I knew you were going to ask me about it, but my recollections are very scanty. The answer is I don't know.
Have you any idea what the reaction amongst the airmen and NCOs was?
One of something approaching disbelief. I think all the people on the station, I think, thought about Gordon in relation to this alleged crime, and thought really that he was a pretty unlikely person. I think there was a feeling, even at that time, that perhaps he was the sort of person who could been selected as somebody that could have been worked upon, if you like, that he was perhaps not as resilient as some of the people and would have been a person who would give up under questioning.
The first news came out, oh my God, has he cracked up altogether? But when we sat down and talked about it, you just could not believe that even if he had cracked up, it would resort to the sort of violence that had been used in this case. It was just impossible to picture Iain being so violent.
They had to get an accused, they had to convict somebody. It wasn't going to be left in the air.